Well, I hope you guys had a good Christmas and New Year break. 2025, hey? I'm feeling positive about this year. I feel like it's going to be a good year. The economy's going to prosper. Chatter about financial crises is going to really die down this year.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warned Congress on Friday the U.S. will hit its debt limit within the next few weeks.
In a letter sent to Congress yesterday, she says the Treasury will have to take extraordinary measures to pay Washington's bills on time.
All right. I guess not, because the debt ceiling is back, and once again, Congress needs to find a solution fast to ensure the US doesn't default on its debts. And the most annoying thing about this is they did this to themselves. Congress voted to suspend the debt ceiling until January 1st, 2025. What a lovely New Year's gift for your future self. Nothing like a bit of financial stress to start the new year right. And you think I'm layering it on? You think that's hyperbole? Well, think again, because just last week with the reinstatement of the debt ceiling, Janet Yellen wrote in a letter that, quote, Treasury currently expects to reach the new limit between January 14th and January 23rd, at which time it will be necessary for Treasury to start taking extraordinary measures to stop the United States defaulting on its loans. And I guess that's the end of my holiday. So for those that don't know about the debt ceiling in the United States, it's kind of a quirky rule that isn't particularly common elsewhere around the world, that just occasionally lets politicians play a really dangerous game of political chicken, where the thing at stake is the global economy as we know it today. So to break things down, the United States government has income and expenses. They raise money through taxes, whether that be income taxes, corporate taxes, tariffs, really whatever they can think of. And then they have a big long list of expenses as well. Social Security, Medicare, defense, health, interest, the list goes on. Now, fiscal year to date, so since October 2024, the government has brought in $630-ish billion of revenue. The problem is they've spent $1.25 trillion. Now, that's not the best. And what it means every time this scenario happens where there's more spending than there is income is the US government has to borrow money to make up the shortfall. It's like us trying to buy a house. We don't have $1 million just to spend on a house. So we have to borrow some money from the bank to spend that extra money that we don't have. Now, the only difference is that in this situation, the government doesn't just turn to a bank to borrow its money. It gets it from investors like you, me, big money managers, and even other countries. Countries like Japan, China, the UK, Luxembourg, the Cayman Islands, Canada, France, Belgium, Switzerland, Taiwan, Singapore, Norway, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Australia, and the list goes on. You can see the point, right? With the US dollar being the reserve currency of the world, pretty much every country holds US debt, and it's really important that the US government continues to pay back its debts. So Congress puts a limit on the total amount the government can borrow to pay its bills, and when they want to raise the limit, they all come together and chat about it and have to approve a new limit. And in principle, that sounds like a decent idea, right? It forces lawmakers to periodically assess the country's borrowing and spending habits, acting as a check on government overreach. It draws public attention to the national debt levels, meaning greater awareness of fiscal issues among citizens and policymakers. And most notably, it protects against catastrophic hyperinflation or a global financial crisis, because the government can't just borrow insane amounts of money and financially cripple the country. So there are genuine arguments for the use of a debt ceiling, but these days, it also causes some really bad problems. The main problem being that raising the debt ceiling has now become a political bargaining tool. For example, you guys probably remember 18 months ago when the debt ceiling was making the news. The Senate was blue, but the House of Representatives was red. Biden was hoping for a clean rise in the debt ceiling, but the House Republicans passed a bill that paired a debt ceiling increase with spending cuts, essentially using the debt ceiling as a bargaining chip. Now, what ended up happening in this situation is that the negotiations between the Republicans and the Democrats went on and on and on, and an agreement was only reached at the 11th hour.
After weeks of negotiations, the president says the two sides have reached a compromise. The breakthrough coming just days before June 5th, the date Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warned the U.S. could run out of cash to pay all of its bills on time. The showdown over the debt ceiling has been looming over the U.S. economy.
They pushed it until there was literally days left until the U.S. was going to start defaulting on some of its loans. And regardless of which political party you support, normalizing this is very dangerous because of the potential fall out should the US default on any of its debts.
Because it prevents, in his words, what could have been a catastrophic default and would have led to an economic recession, retirement accounts devastated, and millions of jobs lost.
And that brings us to what's going on today, because the solution that Congress came up with, in a stroke of pure brilliance, was to just worry about it later. Yes, their solution was to suspend the debt ceiling until the 1st of January 2025. Happy New Year, everybody. So what exactly is the situation that we're looking at now? Well, when the debt ceiling was suspended in June of 2023, the ceiling was set at 31.4 trillion. But because it was a suspension, now that it gets reinstated at whatever the debt level was at the end of last year. And get this, the US national debt as of December 31st was not 31.4 trillion, rather it was 36.1 trillion. I kid you not, the United States government managed to grow the debt pile by 15% in the space of 18 months. And this all comes back to the idea we were talking about before. The United States runs a monster deficit. They spend a lot more than they earn. And until that massive gap between spending and income is controlled, the US will have to continue adding to that big old pile of debt. But of course, with the debt ceiling in place, that complicates things. Now, I will just clarify, the debt ceiling relates to the amount of money the US government can borrow to pay its bills. It doesn't authorize new spending. It just allows the government to meet obligations already approved by Congress. But the point stands that with the US government running a monster deficit, they will most certainly need to raise the debt ceiling just to borrow enough to meet their obligations. So all this is to say, you're probably going to see a lot more chatter about the debt ceiling this year, and it sounds like action will be needed very shortly to ensure the US can continue to pay its debts. And despite the Republicans' clean sweep in the recent US election, it still seems that this isn't a done deal. For example, Fitch has come out recently saying that it is skeptical that a debt limit suspension or increase will be implemented quickly, stating the US faces significant fiscal policy challenges in 2025. We believe it is unlikely that these will be resolved expeditiously because of long-standing weaknesses in the federal government's budgetary process and a narrow Republican House majority. And that's a really interesting point to discuss because Donald Trump has come out recently and said he's actually in favor of completely abolishing the debt ceiling. In a phone interview with NBC News, Trump said getting rid of the debt ceiling entirely would be, quote, the smartest thing Congress could do, and that, quote, he would support that entirely. But his position contrasts with the hardline fiscal conservatives in his own party, who are reluctant to approve increases without significant spending reforms. Ultimately, what this means is that with only a narrow Republican majority in the House, it makes it difficult to unify the party around a single strategy. And that is probably why we're going to see a lot more squabbling this year. And I really don't like to see this at all. One of the words that is used extensively when talking about the debt ceiling is brinkmanship. And I think that's a really worrying thing. Brinkmanship is, quote, the practice of pursuing a dangerous policy to the limits of safety before stopping. But really, we know it simply as chicken. It's a game of chicken that gets played between the two parties to push each other to their absolute limits. But in the case of the debt ceiling debate, the consequence of not raising it could be very severe. Even temporary delays in debt repayment erode confidence in US fiscal policy. And if Congress fails to act, the US could genuinely default on its debt, which would most likely trigger a big financial crisis. There are really 6 main consequences of pushing the debt ceiling debate too far. One is that the US credit rating would take a hit, meaning investors would likely demand higher yields on Treasury bonds to compensate for this perceived risk, which would mean higher cost of servicing government debt, which creates that snowball effect on the federal budget. Another likely problem would be a weakening in the US dollar, so a default would definitely undermine confidence in the dollar as the world's reserve currency, most likely prompting central banks and investors to reduce their holdings of dollar-denominated assets. This would also have a flow-on effect to global trade. As we know, most international contracts and financial transactions are conducted in US dollars, so a default would destabilize the dollar's value, and companies reliant on dollar-denominated trade could face losses. Also, banks and financial institutions holding US treasuries as collateral could face margin calls or liquidity crises due to the reduced value of their assets. This could lead to a credit crunch, limiting access to loans for businesses or individuals. If bond yields spike, you would also imagine equity prices would tank, disrupting portfolios around the world. And then you actually get to the real world consequences, the boots on the ground consequences. If the US Treasury ran out of cash to pay its obligations, it would unfortunately mean that Social Security benefits, military salaries, and interest payments to everyday people holding Treasury bonds would be delayed. This would mean millions of Americans currently reliant on federal payments would face financial hardship. Consumer spending would likely drop, and this could even lead to a slowing of the economy and thus job losses for everyday people. Any way you spin it, the idea of not raising the debt ceiling because of political jousting is just a bad idea. But there are also some who believe that this political brinkmanship around the debt ceiling doesn't actually matter, and they'll bring up the case of 2011. In mid-2011, Congress and the Obama administration were locked in a political impasse over raising the debt ceiling, and on August 2nd, 2011, just hours before the Treasury would have exhausted its borrowing authority, Congress passed the Budget Control Act of 2011, getting the debt ceiling raised. At the time, Standard & Poor's downgraded the credit rating of the United States from AAA to AA+, which marked the first time in history that the US lost its top credit rating. Now, people thought this was going to cause a lot of turmoil, but it kind of didn't. The Dow Jones did fall 635 points, or 5.6%, on August 8th, 2011, the first trading day after the downgrade. But contrary to expectations, yields on US Treasuries actually fell. Now, at the time, there were broader economic risks, such as the European sovereign debt crisis playing out, but even considering this, it still showed that investors went back to US Treasuries for safety, and US Treasuries remained one of the most liquid and trusted assets globally. Even recently, Donald Trump has come out saying the debt ceiling is a meaningless concept and that no one knows for sure what would happen if it were someday to be breached. He said, quote, "It doesn't mean anything except psychologically," saying that a breach could be a, quote, "catastrophe" or meaningless. So overall, it is a hotly debated topic. Some people think that we need the debt ceiling to ensure the government can't go crazy. Others just see the frustration of the political brinkmanship and just want to get rid of it altogether, as most other countries don't even have a debt ceiling and they seem to work out fine. But with that said, definitely let me know your opinion down in the comments section below. Should the US keep the debt ceiling? Should they suspend it again? Or should they abolish it altogether, like Donald Trump suggests? Let me know down in the comment section below. And finally, if you are one of my Australian viewers and you want to get 12 months free brokerage, you can do so by transferring a stock portfolio over $1,000 Australian dollars in value across to the Stake platform. That's the broker that I've been using for the past 7 years, and I'm happy to call them long-term supporters of the channel as well. So details are in the description. The code NEWMONEY will also get you some goodies if you're just looking to set up a share trading account. So definitely check them out if you'd like. But with that said, guys, thank you very much for tuning in. It's good to be back, and I'll see you all in the next video.